Well, good morning, everybody, or evening,
Hello.
or night. I always say good morning because it's morning here, and
It's
I
the
just
only one that
assume that
matters.
everyone is experiencing life the same way I am. That's you guys
It's
are,
true.
yeah.
It is true.
I
Yeah.
only have my own experiences, and I can only talk about my own experiences.
And they are
Good
absolute
morning.
and they are truth. And that is postmodernism in your
Yeah,
body.
you guys need to get on my train. Get on my train of life. Walk a mile in my
Amazing.
shoes, and then we'll see. Anyway, once again, we have derailed our morning introductions, or evening, or night. I keep saying morning. I am joined this week, as always, with the beautiful and lovely Tim Miller, who is over
Hello.
in England. Good day, Governor.
Good
Uh,
good day.
Good day.
It's a bit more
Um,
Australian, probably, but yeah,
I think
sure.
that is Australian. No, that's put another shrimp on the barbie. Let's see how many cultures we can
Look, how many people
upset.
we can offend before we've even
Yeah,
started? Yeah.
yeah. The show's about forgiveness.
Yeah. I'm going to take you to that place where you want to push us off the edge
Yeah,
and then end in a place where you embrace us with loving warmth. So,
which is really the story of Jesus. Like when he's in the temple and he's reading the book from Isaiah, and
yeah.
then they're like get mad and they want to push him off a cliff, and he turns around and walks
Mm,
right through them, and
yeah,
then
yeah.
later they embrace him. Maybe
And then
we are,
crucify him.
maybe we are following in Christ's footsteps closer than we thought.
There you
And I
go.
am Derek Wilson. I am here on Vancouver Island at St. Andrew's Church here in Duncan, and we've been doing this for almost a year. Uh,
Wow.
Used to do go through some Bible passages. I'm sure we'll get back to that, but lately we have been going through some themes and maybe
Mm,
some questions um, that you guys may have. I know we talked about kind of our journeys on
mhm,
where we've gotten to kind of our faith road now. And last week we touched a little bit on sin and salvation and kind of some different ideas we have. And this week Tim has something he wants to do, and I don't know what it is. So I am as eager as you guys are to figure out what it is and try not to make a fool of myself.
Well,
Um,
you can always just make a fool of me, and that'll work.
no, I do. I do. That's gonna happen. Anyway, it's great to have you
Mm,
guys. And if you guys have a topic or a um, suggestion or anything you
mm.
guys want us to discuss, throw a comment down below or um, once again our social media pages that we don't really check. Do that. Or if you're listening to this, I'm sure you either know me or Tim or have us as friends on Facebook or Instagram or something like that. You can throw us a question that
Reach
way
out. Yeah.
as well. Um, all questions are
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
you can find us. I think we're both in some ways just because of our work at our churches and stuff like that as well, fairly kind of publicly accessible. So,
yeah,
Google us and find us, and yeah, look us up however you need to.
St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Duncan, BC. I'm on the website, got my email,
Yeah.
all that kind of stuff. So yeah, because we would love to. We're just kind of making this up as we go, and we would love some direction. We keep casting lots before the episodes, and that's going well. But
It's awkward when you're like picking straws and we're not able to pick from the same straws, and so
yeah,
we both have the short straw, and then it just yeah.
yeah, it doesn't work. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
Distance isn't always the best. Yeah, so I'm going to turn it over to Tim. And
Hmm.
what do you have planned for us, or the idea you have?
There you go. Well, yeah. So what I was last week when we were talking about sin and then touching on salvation, and we ended up rightly so looking a little bit into Genesis, and I've got this like kind of idea of maybe a slightly different way to look at how at Genesis and how we understand kind of the fall of humanity and for me it's something that I hope kind of becomes or helps to kind of shape the ongoing conversation about kind of the relatedness of God to us in the midst of our brokenness in humanity, as compared to an emphasis on kind of like the originality of sin and kind of this sinful world in which humans participate, and we hope that God eventually has enough grace to kind of see us in it. So so I, this is kind of, I'll present it as clearly as I can, and then I'd love to kind of catch your feedback, Derek, and see, this might be one of these things, which is very possible,
Yeah.
where in my mind it sounds really interesting and really exciting, and I think it's great, and then I share it with somebody, and they're like, "Oh wow, you basically just recreated the McDonald's menu and called it Dairy Queen." So this could be a moment like that, but
What a great analogy. I love it.
we
Perfect.
we've made our hamburgers square,
Yeah.
and so it's not the same as anybody else's.
Yeah.
But yeah, excellent. So let me just walk you through the kind of the idea here,
Okay.
and then yeah, we'll literally get your live reaction to it as it's happening. This is entirely new information.
I
Um,
don't know what to do with this.
okay, so and the kind of traditional idea of sin, right? So we have the Garden of Eden, we have Adam and Eve being created, and God says, "I've given you everything here on the earth or in the garden to eat, but and eat of anything you want, but don't eat from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, for if you eat it, you will surely die." And then famously, the serpent comes along, gets Eve, and he says, "Did God say you shall not eat of any tree in the garden?" And she says, "No, we may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God says if we eat of the one in the middle of the garden or touch it, we shall die." So she's already added something else into it, an additional prohibition. But then they eat it very famously, because the serpent said, "You will not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, of this tree from the knowledge of good and evil, you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And it's at that point in the story that Eve eats, and then she turns, and apparently Adam's just been kind of standing there like a lump, just listening to the whole conversation, and then takes a bite
Yeah.
as well afterwards. But so what I'd love to think about is what I find fascinating about that is that what the serpent uses is this proclamation that you will be like God if you eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And what I find interesting about that is that the affirmation earlier on in Genesis is that humankind is made in the image of God. Our scriptures tell us all the way through that we are not created to become God, but that in our creation and in the transformation of the Spirit in us, we become more like Jesus. The sanctification and glorification of who we are, as those who have been saved by grace, is about becoming more like God. Sharing in the characteristics that make God who God is. And so at the heart of that is actually what I think is true, in that Adam and Eve were meant to know the difference between good and evil. They were meant to have knowledge of good and evil, but what they did was that they jumped ahead from learning it from God as they matured, and instead grasped for something that was out of their maturity, out of their time, out of their understanding. And so then they move from one extreme to the other, where in one moment everything is prohibited, and like there's the prohibition, and they understand the world as being kind of good and a gift to them. And then it sounds like instantly they move to the thing of having shame over their nakedness. They don't even want to be kind of seen by each other, let alone seen by God. And kind of everything kind of breaks and fractures along the way. And what I what I was kind of thinking about is the way that actually, if we look at like the development of children and how we grow up and how we mature, which is a big thing that Paul talks about that we're supposed to be doing in our faith, is actually it's the things that we say at the beginning, which are kind of an absolute do this, don't do this, are actually things that we're meant to be able to navigate and grow into as we get older, right? So so like the don't touch the stove because it's hot and it'll burn you. Well, that only works for as long as the child has no understanding of how to turn the stove on and off, and when they're too small to engage with it. But as they grow up, they start to gain the ability to actually use the stove. So what starts as like this extreme prohibition of don't do this actually becomes something that they get to know and learn and experience as they're older in a different way. And what goes alongside of that then too is when God finds Adam and Eve hiding, and they go through the ramifications of what happens. He speaks to, not to Adam and Eve, but to whether to other parts of the Trinity or angels. It's kind of fairly unclear, but he says, we're going to send Adam and Eve out of the garden so that they don't eat from the tree of life and don't live forever. And there's a sense that actually the tree of life was never prohibited. It was just the knowledge of good and evil. And so there's a sense that actually they were meant to eat of what was meant to give them life forever, but needed to grow into their image of God in themselves, understanding right and wrong, good and evil. But because they'd mixed it up, then they get removed from living forever in that kind of brokenness, so that there's redemption that can come. Because in Revelation, it's the tree of life that gets reinstituted at the center of New Jerusalem, and brings healing for the nations and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I like the idea of they were always meant to know good and evil. Um, I never actually even thought about that before. When you're talking, the first thing that kind of jumped out to me was um, like they're made in the image of God,
Mm,
right? And then later, um, they want to become God, become
mm,
like God, to
mm,
knowing the good and evil. Is an image the same thing as the real thing,
mm,
or is the image the leading to the thing, right? Like this is a picture of a place. That's where you want to
mm,
go. You have to actually go there to experience
mm,
it. But just the fact that, like, if you hold to the creation story written
mm,
in the Bible, um, why was there even a tree of good and knowledge of
mm,
good and evil there, right? Like, if they
mm,
weren't supposed to do it,
mm.
um, then why was it even there? Was that temptation necessary? Or maybe is temptation a part of the Christian faith that we need to walk through,
Mm,
right?
mm.
Um, maybe there's
And
some part of it.
that's yeah, yeah, and I think that sense, like at least in my own life,
Yeah.
there's been times where I can look and I was like, oh gosh, it wasn't that what I was doing was wrong. It was just not the right time
Yeah.
to.
No, I definitely like
Yeah.
where you went with that. I mean, I think there's lots of stuff. Um, even in my own life,
Mhm.
of dreams or passions or something, and I've jumped the gun in doing
Mm,
them, and they haven't really worked out. But later on, when I come back, it's quite a bit different. Like when I went to
mm,
Bible school, it was to become a youth pastor,
mm,
um, and then I did Bible school, and then I did concrete, and then I did plumbing, and then I did concrete again, and now I went into youth ministry, right? And I think if I would have
Mm,
gone right after Bible school, um, quote unquote, maybe when my stock was high and I may have had more options or something,
mm,
um, I don't think it. I think it would have wrecked me more than it does now. Um,
mm,
sorry,
mm.
that's saying that it's wrecking me now. Well, youth ministry in COVID is not super fun, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it would have. I don't know if I would have been able to handle the ups and downs as much
Mm,
now,
mm,
or had the ability to have groups outside of the church
mm,
as much, right? Like the fire hall or different jobs
mm,
or whatever, to
mm.
keep me somewhat grounded and
Yeah,
based.
yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I think you can do that, and even in the
Mm,
Bible, um, like when we're teaching people about the Bible, there's a reason why we don't go straight into, you know, transubstantiation and all that kind of stuff like instantly, right? Like what's gonna how's it gonna help, right? Like it's God loves you,
mm,
God died for you, um,
mm,
and you know, go to heaven or whatever you may hold to. Um, so like there's reasons we keep it simple, and
mm,
then you kind of wade into it if you drop people off
mm,
right away. And that's why we have to have grace for people, right?
mm,
That's why, because we can't, like, we're not expecting them to know everything right off the bat. We don't know everything.
mm,
And so there's going to be times of trembling and,
mm.
and pain. And I mean, in the garden, when God kicks him out, um, was that was that necessarily the worst thing? I, I
Mm,
I guess what I'm saying, like obviously it introduced sin into the world and stuff. Once again, if you're holding
mm.
to the literal creation
Literally. Yeah,
story
yeah,
of the
yeah.
Bible, um, but like without that sin, without that pain, without that hurt, would we have the deep connections we have with people? Like when we walk
Mm,
through problems with people, when we can lean on, when we can
mm,
help people, when we can do these things, right? Like did it add a depth to our relationships that's possible,
mm,
um, because we're relying on each other,
mm,
um, more. We need that. Maybe it's not.
mm.
Um,
Because
so
there's that place, like as you say, the simplicity of in some ways the response to the love of God is ultimately this like open door, all are welcome, right?
yeah,
And then and at least in my experience, I have seen every shape of human being, from every walk of life, respond to God's love in different ways, in different churches, in different contexts. And it's only after kind of people have come and responded to that same message, we start to then pick apart the differences of the people in the room, in that sense, right? Like as you say, it starts with this very kind of open general, um and and yeah, and kind of doesn't have the kind of the deep theological nuances and arguments that we've kind of held in the church over the last 2000 years. It's just this, God loves you, and you are welcome, you're part of the family of God. And
yeah,
then we start to recognize that there's differences in us, and those differences aren't just, at least in the way, I grew up thinking those differences were just the kind of pre-Christian life, right? And then you
yeah,
got into the Christian life, and at that point, everything was then supposed to start to feel much more, um, like monocultural, right? Like
yeah,
everybody was slowly supposed to start to sound like each other and look like each other, and and want the same things, and prioritize the same things. And then as you start to kind of still sense those differences, it became this, it became this kind of point of kind of like contention and friction.
yeah,
And actually, I think, again, made in the image of God, as people who believe in God as Trinity, we believe that the harmony and oneness of God comes because of the division and threeness of God.
Yeah.
And so actually, and I think like that's one of the things I love about the kind of opening piece here is what it, for me, what it feels like is Adam and Eve jump into something too soon, and
Mm.
it becomes the thing that like ruptures and fractures what could have, which would have always had, like, human relationships always have that kind of space where things get a bit more difficult, that even when you love somebody and you really kind of connect with them, you always come to a point where they want something different than you, or they prioritize or need something different than you. um and but Adam and Eve kind of walk into that, like, instantly. And there's a sense of like actually ending up in a place where you're not able to then in a healthy way navigate and grow together. And
Mhm.
instead you see it as this like me versus you, like, even like the prophecy over Eve is, your desire will be for your husband, but he will be your master, he will be, over you. And there's a sense of like the friction that's in there.
There
um
was a podcast I was listening to that was a small group of us
mm,
listened to after class. They did a thing on that, and their whole thing was, that curse. It wasn't about men being dominant or
mm,
controlling over it. It was more women will. I might butcher this, and I apologize if I do. But it wasn't that men would be controlling it and over
mm,
it. Like it would be that she would desire to be in the place of her husband or
mm,
something like that. It was quite
mm,
a. I wish I would remember it, but it was a long time I
mm,
listened to it. But it was a really interesting take on
mm,
that, and actually the whole Adam and Eve thing, and
mm,
well, a lot of stuff that we read in the Old Testament that we hold to being
mm,
unclean or interpret it in different ways that
mm.
really we miss the mark on quite a lot of it.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, I, I
Mm,
I just want to throw this out there
yeah.
was if you're watching this and you're interested in um, the creation story and maybe
Mm,
how evolution fits with that or things like that, how you can kind of hold two views together.
mm,
Um, there's a great book that helped me a lot called "I Love Jesus and I Accept Evolution." I
mm.
think Nathan McLean may have
Yeah, okay.
by Denise Lemerle, but he's a theologian and a scientist, and he goes through a bunch of different things
Mm,
and that, and is very very interesting. Not to
mm.
sideswipe the
No,
conversation,
no,
but
no, no.
but
Yeah.
um, it's a resource for you if you're questioning that
Mm,
kind of stuff. His whole
mm,
thing was, if I remember correctly, the sin of man. Like if you don't hold to the Adam and Eve literal story,
mm, mm,
sin of man was if we came from descendant ancestors, same ancestors that apes come from. Um, the fall of man is actually when we became self-conscious, when we
mm,
understood that our actions have
mm,
consequences and continue to do those with
mm,
negative consequences.
mm,
That was
mm,
the fall of man. So
mm,
very, very interesting.
mm, mm.
And struggled with. He himself struggled with a lot of the questions we have.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I
I think that's really important though. Like, is that like, and one of the reasons I bring this up today is just kind of part of the conversation is also to hopefully give people permission to say, I'm reading something and I believe it, but I
yeah,
feel like there might be something else to it for me.
yeah,
And like, I think for me, Genesis, the beginning chapters of Genesis were always used as like this, given to me as this clear picture of how sin entered the world, how we know that the world and physicality is a sinful, negative place
yeah,
that is against the will of God. And everything that we tell you after that is about trying to get back to before the sinfulness had entered.
yeah,
And actually, I think there's a lot more nuance, and there's a lot more beauty, and there's a lot more faithfulness of God in that,
yeah,
which, as you say, does actually can resonate with some other things that we're kind of experiencing or understanding in the world, that don't deny God and God's activity and participation in the world and in creation, but also don't have to just like put blinders up and say, but this is just what I've been taught and this is how it
yeah,
fits.
yeah,
And I think, like one of the other classic stories of somebody kind of stepping out of place is Peter. And he, in the famous passage where Jesus is talking to his disciples about that, the path of the Messiah is one that leads to suffering and death.
yeah,
And Peter famously takes him aside and says, God, Jesus, that's not the path that you're on. And he says, get behind me, Satan.
yeah,
And it's just, and that's, one of the nuances of that actually isn't just that this is a temptation for Jesus, but it's also that Peter moves from, in that moment, moves from being the follower of Jesus to try to be the leader of Jesus, and
yeah,
doesn't recognize, where he's sitting in that relationship. And again, that whole thing at Genesis is all about, Adam and Eve taking hold and thinking that they're the ones who can kind of tell God who they are and what they're learning and what they're doing and what they need, as compared to recognizing God as the one who created them and loves them and sustains them and is with them, is the
mhm,
one who is and wants the best for them. It's not that things won't happen and that they won't have an awakening, they won't have that consciousness come up, they won't have that, that sense of their conscious or conscience, and morality and things like that. But it's just that those things you grow into,
yeah,
you become more hopefully more mature in those things. And I think, when you look around our world right now, the things that really make me despair the most is the places where it does just feel like, children throwing their toys out of their prams, like, and it's just like, surely, especially when you've got adults running countries or supposed to be, you just think to yourself, like, where's the maturity, where's the recognition that, like, that we're humans, that we have value, we have importance,
yeah,
and actually, there's bigger and more nuanced conversations, and it's not just a matter of, shut this down, let this through, or, this is good for our economy, this is bad for it, but actually, recognizing the human value, and participation in life in it, as well. But yeah.
yeah. And like when you're talking about being human and diversity and the different denominations and stuff, you can
Mm,
either condemn there are differences or you can celebrate them, right?
mm,
And so I think sometimes we tend to do a lot more condemning than celebrating
mm.
if people
Yeah,
have different views or
yeah, yeah,
different
yeah,
ways of doing things.
yeah.
And yeah, like that's
Mm,
like one of the biggest things for me to realize is growing up, I have a very white middle class male centric view of the Bible, or I was
mm,
being taught that a
mm,
Western civilization view of the
mm,
Bible.
mm,
And that's a very narrow slice of it. And I
mm.
was missing a lot on allowing different interpretations and different viewpoints of it. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
if you
yeah.
think you've been taught, like I remember I was at a camp once and someone came up to me and we were just talking. She was a junior leader or something. She was like, my parents grew up and they made us question the Bible and really dig deep and do all this kind of
Mm,
stuff. I'm like, great, awesome. And then I know that that wasn't true. Like I know she probably thought it was really deep and
mm.
tearing things apart, um,
Yeah.
but there was no real questions being asked there or
Mm,
real
mm,
doubt or whatever, right?
mm,
Um,
mm,
and it took me a long time to realize that my deep questions and my um, diving into the Bible was still quite shallow,
mm.
um,
Yeah, yeah,
in what it is, right? Like you read a
yeah, yeah.
commentary, but
Mm,
your understanding of that commentary is based on a still a very limited
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
experience, right?
Yeah.
And like you're still interpreting
Mm.
different things
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
about that in a very
Mm.
one way.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Definitely.
and so
Yeah.
to see different things, and I don't have to agree with all the other
Mm.
interpretations, and I don't have to follow
Mm.
all of them,
Mm.
but I should be made aware of them, right? Like I should
Mm.
take everything because even if, like some of the things I was kind of interested in learning about even at Bible school that I
Mm.
didn't hold to, then I'm like, oh, that can't be right. Like I
Mm.
don't hold to that yet,
Mm.
or I don't hold to that now. Like as you say, maturing and now knowing
Mm.
more right and wrong and the meat and not just the milk kind of thing. Now I would say that I'd hold some of those things that I was opposed to back
Yeah.
then,
Yeah. Mm.
but it's changed over time.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
And if I wasn't made aware of those back then, I may not have
Mm.
the framework to understand where I am now.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I think like that's part of it too, right? Is like Trip Fuller is I've heard him say a few times that like that his understanding of the church um and kind of who's in the church in some senses has to include every variation of Christian he's ever been. Otherwise it's not it's both
mhm,
not kind of comprehensive enough to truly be God's kingdom and God's family, but also too then it pushes him to actually extend grace to people when they not may not be where he's at right now.
mhm,
And as you say, I think there's like that mix of like where what you realize as you grow as you grow up sometimes is actually there you thought you kind of were given this open end of, I can ask any questions, I can push any boundary,
yeah,
this is a safe space. But then you realize that actually those were even in some ways dictated. It's like those
yeah,
are okay questions here, because I remember reading it was Ben St. Pierre for his final year at Bible college for his bachelor's had done a pre-thesis, and he had done it on open theism. And I remember reading it, and it was like the first time I'd ever heard of open theism, and I was just like, oh my god, my best friend's a heretic. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and I was just like, I remember I had to pull him aside and be like, do you actually believe this, or is this like just an academic exercise? And how come you didn't condemn these people as like the end of your paper and things
yeah,
like that? But it was that kind of that place of, as you say, like, you wrestle with those things to continue to kind of build the framework of your understanding. And it both lets you know that you haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the things you can know and understand about God, a relationship of God's work in the world. And yet at the same time too, gives you more things to actually kind of hang your understanding and your experiences on, which can constantly be, and if you open yourself up humbly, to be transformed and challenged by the experiences of others. And it's actually it's harder, it takes more time for it not to just be something that kind of disrupts and breaks you and leaves you kind of weeping in a corner wondering if anything is true at all. But or it's got but take that time and you walk through it. And if we can create places where people can have that, so they can both say, I've got this question but I can't dive fully into it yet because I just it would upset too much of my life right now, and that's okay, right?
yeah.
Like, but the fact is we need to kind of keep growing, keep building, keep, as you say, kind of finding the meat, and
Yeah.
and chewing the solid food instead of the milk and things
Yeah.
like that. And
Like when I come up against, or I shouldn't say come up, when I come across something that's a different, um, theology or something that I hold to, I don't automatically go, well, this is what I believe now or whatever. I still, when people ask me, I would still say I hold to the old thing until the new thing has kind of
mm,
worked its way into the old way in, and I actually have a framework for that.
mm,
Um, so that's kind of what it's. I was just thinking, like, we spend so much time like saying don't put God in a box and stuff,
mm,
and we hardly ever spend time realizing that we are the ones in the box,
Yeah.
right? Like we have
Mm,
very limited view.
mm,
We're like, don't put God in the box. He can do
yeah.
whatever he wants.
Mm,
But realize that we are the ones actually in the box, and we,
yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, we have
Yeah.
um, a
Yeah.
perimeter. We have an area we fill, and the more
Yeah.
we experience and the more we learn about that perimeter, that area
Yeah.
may grow.
Mm,
Um, but it's
yeah.
still
Mm,
limited, and that's
yeah.
once again that's the beauty of the church is
Yeah. Yeah.
all these ones come together and saying,
Mm,
this is my experience of God, because I
mm,
may be missing
mm,
something, or a
mm,
different interpretation of a verse may be way more opening and lead
mm,
to a whole different view and truth about God that I may be missing because I
yeah.
haven't experienced that and I haven't
Mm,
heard, right? So that's why that's why talking and sharing your
mm,
testimonies and
mm,
not condemning people for seeing things differently, but celebrating it, um,
yeah.
is
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
Um,
And praying, like I think that's the thing too, is like, you hold that as well within, asking God to open your eyes to see God in that,
yeah,
whether it's a conversation with somebody, or whether it's an experience you have yourself. And it's like those moments where you, as you say, you kind of try to kind of squeeze God back into a box, but that's usually because that's where you're trying to find
yeah,
yourself or whatever. And I think, like, as you were talking, I was just reminded of, as you grow up and you start to realize that, like, your parents' life doesn't revolve around you, that
yeah.
they do things outside. Like, you might, even when you kind of first actually start to realize that, when you're, they drop you off at school and then they pick you up from school, and in your mind they're kind of everything that they've done now that day is
They've
just
been
revolved
outside
around you.
the
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
for the whole day, just
And
waiting for
yeah,
you, right?
and yeah, yeah, and then you realize, actually, they're not, that's not the box that they're confined to, right?
Yeah,
Like, they have a life, they have, they have agency, they have things that they're doing outside of that. And it doesn't mean that they don't love you and they're not there for you. It just means that life is different and
yeah,
bigger and more complex, and it's full of kind of, multiple connecting boxes, maybe, instead of just kind of the one you kind of
yeah.
think is most comfortable or safe or
God,
whatever.
God works outside of you and outside of the church.
Yeah.
Um, he is always working, and we
Mm,
either have eyes to see it or we don't. And I think that's, I mean, maybe we'll save a little more deconstruction for later, but I think
mm,
that's people are leaving the church because they're like, God's working outside the church and doing
mm,
sometimes
mm,
more things in line with what I think
mm,
the kingdom of God is. So I'm going
mm,
to go join him over there.
mm, mm,
But yeah,
mm.
anyway,
There you go.
that seems
So
like a good place to end.
that
Right?
sounds great. Yeah. Thanks for joining me on my little
Well,
journey.
I don't know if I answered the question, but we did have a good
No,
conversation.
yeah. That's what it's all about there.
Yeah.
That's what it's
Yeah.
all about.
Well, yeah, like that's okay. Maybe we're not done yet. Um, but
P.S. Yeah.
like the whole reason we started this podcast was to just take some verses that maybe haven't spent a lot of time on and just kind of
Mm,
reread them, bouncing ideas back and forth,
mm,
and maybe seeing them in a new way. And that's
mm,
what we want people to do with the Bible, right? We want them to read something and just spend some time in it and ask some questions. Like,
mm,
pick a verse and just think of three questions that you can ask this
mm,
verse. Like,
mm,
even just who's it written for is a huge question to ask. Why was it written?
mm,
And then whatever else. I don't want to give you questions that you can ask, but those two will really change how you
mm,
view the the Bible.
mm,
And that's the beauty of this book is that it's so um, people think that it's like a dock and you can't get
mm,
off of the dock or else you're going to drown, right? And you
mm,
can only go to certain edges instead of like an anchor on a boat and you're anchored to it, but you can go and go
mm,
around it and
mm,
experience and learn more things as long as it's
mm,
anchored on that, right? It's not a
mm,
cage, it's a It's a safety line.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we want to do here is just
Mm.
check out different things and read different things and even when the Bible um, talks about things that we think that we know, well, let's dissect it. Let's look into it. Even when the Bible's contradictory to itself.
Shocking.
What? What?
Don't take me. Don't
That's
take me there. I can't handle it. Can't handle
yeah. No. No. So, we'll talk about that later. But anyway,
it.
yeah. So anyway,
Cool.
blessings to you all.
Mm-hmm.
Hope you have a great week, and
Yeah.
we'll see you
And do
next
be
week.
in touch.
Be in touch. Questions. That's that. That's all we need. There is no. If you've listened to us, you know there's no dumb questions. So
No,
send us one.
we ask a lot of dumb questions so that you can ask other questions that are
Yeah,
definitely not dumb. Yeah.
absolutely. Okay. Blessings.
Peace.
Toodles.
Love you.